Hey everyone, Cleo here and welcome to another video. This time I'm going to be doing my sort of like dream fantasy TBR. So imagine I have all the time in the world and all the money and all the shelf space in the world. What would be like the 10 fantasy series that are like the highest priority for me now? Because even though technically in this dream scenario I have all the time in the world and all the money in the world, so basically I could read every single fantasy series that I want to, but of course I in reality and you in reality don't really have the time to hear me talk about every single fantasy out there. So I'm going to limit it to the 10 that are kind of like on the top of my wish list at this point in time. Does that mean that these are like the first fantasies that I'll be picking up next? No, probably not. A lot of these I don't even physically own, so I'll definitely be prioritizing some of the fantasies that I do own, for example. But also some of these are just humongous, so I mean, even if I were to start them, I would have to like binge read an entire like 10 book series in order to be able to finish them, for example. So this is definitely just like, I'm so eager to get to these series at some point, but because I don't see myself being able to fulfill this list anytime soon, I just wanted to get this video out there so that I can talk about them already and like feed my excitement in that way. So without further ado, let's just dive into the list. There is no real particular order to this list. It's just like the 10 books, the 10 series that are like kind of most prominent in my mind at this moment. Some of them are higher priority than others, but you know, I wouldn't say that number one on this list is necessarily the one that I'm like most eager to dive into. But number one on this list is going to be Realm of the Elderlings by Hobb. So this is actually cheating in the sense that it is a combination of multiple series. So there are multiple series within this realm, so it's kind of like a Cosmere for Brandon Sanderson, for example. This is all one realm, one nation, so to call it, one planet, so to call it, in which multiple book series have taken place. I have actually already started this series because I did read the first one in this series like 2 years ago or so, I want to say, and actually, surprisingly enough, I remember quite a lot of that book, but I will still reread it in 2021. It is actually planned for 2021 that I'm going to try and read the first trilogy within this Realm of the Elderlings. So the first trilogy I can kind of talk about because I don't really know all of the series within this realm and what they are all individually about. So in the first series we are following Fitz. Fitz is a bastard child and his father is kind of the heir to the kingdom at the beginning of this book series. However, he's this sort of very honorable person whose reputation means everything to him. So once it is being made general knowledge that he has a bastard child, he steps down. However, Fitz is still an important and an interesting character for the kingdom to keep around. So he is brought up in the castle, but at a certain age they figure out that because he is a bastard son, but he does still have royal blood, he's probably in the sort of like ideal position to turn him into an assassin. Throughout the series we will see him grow up a lot more as well, and I think that in one of the later series within this realm that Hobb has created, we will also be revisiting the character of Fitz. So I did very much enjoy the first one actually, but I wasn't like immediately enamored with it. I didn't absolutely fall in love with it, but I've seen a lot of people who had the same experience with Assassin's Apprentice and then absolutely fell in love with the sequel to this Royal Assassin, and since have really enjoyed every Hobb that they've read, so I'm hoping that that will be the same for me as well. Second series that is kind of high on my to-do list and that is also actually scheduled for 2021. These are the only 2 series on this list that I have concrete plans for, and that will be the Gentleman Bastard series by Scott E. Lynch. As far as I'm aware, there are only 3 books out at this point in this series, but I think a 4th one is in the making. And so in this one we are following, as far as I'm aware, because I really don't know too much about the series except for having heard wonderful things about it, but as far as I'm aware, I think it has to do with sort of like a pirate heist story. But the thing that kind of really draws me into this series is that people are saying that there's just a beautiful friendship, a beautiful bromance at the center of this story, and that you will absolutely fall in love with these characters and with the relationship, the dynamics between them. That is something that I very much look for in my fantasies. It's very much more about character dynamic and like interrelation between characters than it is about the plot in its essence. So very much hoping to be sucked into that world as well. Next up we have a series of which I have the first book for years already. The first book I had on my shelves for such a long time that I think it might have been even super close to when it was starting to get published, and that is the First Law series by Joe Abercrombie. So I had this first book at some point on my shelves and I still haven't read it, and you know, the back of this book has never really appealed to me that much neither, so I have never really prioritized it. But in recent years, when I started to join BookTube and looked at a lot more people who read a whole lot of fantasy and saw their videos and like was watching their videos about their favorite series, this series came up quite a lot, and I became a lot more interested in it as I heard them talking about it, because basically this is very much a character focused fantasy story. And as I just said in my previous entry for this list, I very much love character-focused novels. It's also a grimdark fantasy with which I don't have a lot of experience. I have read Game of Thrones, but we'll say Game of Thrones is not really my sort of writing style, so I'm hoping that writing style-wise I will vibe a little bit better with the First Law trilogy or series. I don't know how many books there are in this series. Apart from that, there's also a character called the Cripple in there, and I'm very interested in that character and in seeing how that representation is handled, because a few years back, or maybe even still this year, I made a video about how I want to dive more into disability representation, and I think I definitely want to be kind of looking at that in the context of the fantasy genre, for example. I really want to be critical of the way in which disability is represented in these books. It's a subject that kind of was drawn to my attention recently when I was reading Stormlight Archive, because there is some representation in there that is handled magnificently, but there's also some representation in there that I definitely don't like. So it's something that I'm very interested in, to look at fantasy in that lens, and so the character of the Cripple is probably something that it could be done very wrong, so I'm very interested to look into my interpretation of that character within this world. Next up we have The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. I have already started this trilogy. I read the first book this year, I think. And so I've definitely wanted to continue, but you know, I haven't found the time to really prioritize that series, and so I definitely want to hopefully get around to it soon, but as I said, this list, I don't know when it's gonna happen. But so The Poppy War is a Chinese inspired fantasy story. It's really a sort of like take no prisoners type of story, because it's very gruesome, it's very brutal, but it is inspired by true events, and it is true representation of what has happened in those events. So with The Poppy War, we're basically kind of looking at modern Chinese history. Let's mainly say like Chinese history starting from like 19th century, probably somewhere around there, starting like right after the Opium Wars in Chinese history, and we're kind of looking at the relationship between China and Japan, at least in the first one. I do think I've seen some hints that we're also kind of looking at the Western world in some of the later books, but basically, as I've seen from some interviews with R.F. Kuang, it's kind of her exploration of how does somebody become a Mao Zedong, how does somebody become this sort of dictator, how does somebody who kind of is at the brink of starting a sort of revolt and of overthrowing a political system, then becomes a sort of like dictator figure. And so in this one we are following a character called Rin. Rin has basically been orphaned in the Opium Wars, and she is somebody who will stop at nothing to achieve what she wants. She's very ambitious, and she's somebody who is often resorts to pain in order to motivate her. So for example, when she's studying at the beginning of this book to enter into this prestigious academy, she will just like burn her hands to make sure that she will stay awake so that she can study more. So she will often be making these sort of questionable decisions in that sense, and that is kind of an early indication of how far she is willing to go to achieve what she wants to. And so I have only read the first one, and so this isn't supposed to be a review, so I'm gonna stop it at here, but I'm very much intrigued to see where it's gonna go. I wasn't a like Poppy War was not a 5-star read for me. It wasn't like I was immediately hooked, like I said, like, okay, this is the best fantasy series ever. There are things that I absolutely love about this book so far, and there are things that I don't particularly vibe with, so it'll be interesting to see how that develops throughout. But I definitely love the representation of Chinese history in here, and the way in which that brutality is portrayed within the story. It's just that some pacing choices, some narrative choices didn't really fully work for me. Fifth series I absolutely want to get to is the Greenbone Saga by Fonda, which is another Asian-inspired fantasy series. I first started hearing about this series about like a year ago, and I'm still like wondering like why didn't I just immediately read it? But basically I just heard from one person who was saying that this was like an amazing book and that more people should be reading it. And then this year, like around the release of the second book, I guess, a lot of people all of a sudden started to dive into the series, started to explore the series, love the series, promote the series. So now it's being lauded everywhere, and I definitely want to read it. So this is basically sort of like gangster mobster fantasy story in which we have these sort of tight-knit family relationships, and these in which we have these sort of like rivaling families and it's all around like the jade trade, and they have the power to make magical jade, I think, or to draw magic out of jade. Not entirely sure, I haven't looked into it too much neither, but I'm just intrigued by that whole sort of setup of like rival families, and you know, the possibility of the feuds between there, but also with like the scheming and things like that. I like mob movies and stuff like that, so I think that this will work very well. Sixth one on here, the series is called The Burning by Evan Winters, and the first book in this is Rage of Dragons. I had never heard of the series name, so that's why I'm saying that. So Rage of Dragons is a book that came out last year, I think, and it's another one that I've mainly been hearing people talk about this year, though I think it did already have like early hype when it first came out. So this is a African-inspired fantasy story in which we're kind of looking at this world in which there's like 1 in 1,000, I think, is born to be able to call on dragons, and 1 in 1,000 is born to be super strong or something. Could be completely wrong about this, but so basically it's a sort of revenge story, because our protagonist is somebody who doesn't have any of these gifts, but he wants to kind of escape the reality he's living in, because there's like war like threatening his environment, but he doesn't manage to escape in time, and all of his friends and families are killed, and so he goes on this quest to seek revenge. Love myself a revenge story, and dragons are involved, so obviously I want to read it. Seventh book in this series is a recent edition, and that is The Ruin of Kings by Jenn Lyons. Basically, I saw somebody who I respect on BookTube give this like a 5-star rating, give the third book in the series a 5-star rating, absolutely raving about it, so now I want to try it as well. And this one actually works on a trope that I very much like, but it subverts the trope as well. So we're kind of looking at an orphan boy who then turns out to be the lost heir to a kingdom. Love that. But it kind of subverts this, because it then shows that this boy is kind of realizing that this isn't really everything he thought it was going to be, that being the lost heir isn't really this sort of like great experience for his life, but also that he isn't really the hero figure, that he's probably actually destined to be the Dark One. So intrigued about that. We'll see how that one works out, but considering that I've seen some very good reviews for it, I'm very much anticipating me loving this one. Next up we get to the Riftwar Saga by Raymond E. Feist, which is like the oldest series on here, I guess. Like I don't have a whole lot of interest in like old fantasy at this point in any case. Probably if I read more fantasy, I want to go back to some of those older, like long established fantasy series, but at this point in time I'm more interested to just look at like the modern stuff, or the like more popular stuff at this point in time. But so Riftwar Saga I am very interested in, because I did read a trilogy that is kind of linked to it somehow. So I don't know too much about Riftwar Saga, but I did read the Empire trilogy, which was co-written by Raymond E. Feist and Jenny Wurtz. And so this one is kind of set in the same world, but in a different kingdom. I think that is the relationship between the two. And in the Empire trilogy, actually a character from the world of the Riftwar Saga appears, and I love that character. And I'm not entirely sure that character is actually in the Riftwar Saga or not, but in any case he does disappear from the Empire trilogy for a time, so I'm hoping that we're following him within the Riftwar Saga, and so I'm down for more of that in any case. In any case, I want to kind of know more about that link between the two, and kind of see, you know, if I love it as much as I love the Empire trilogy. Coming on towards the end of the list, we get to the The Faithful and the Fallen by Gwynne. First book in this is Malice. I will say that I've already forgotten the plot of this because I couldn't kind of keep my focus on reading that plot. I think it was basically just something with a land in which, you know, there used to be all of these giants. There was a war with giants, and the giants have slumbered for a very long time, but they're starting to rise again. And so they want to start a coalition of nations to battle this evil. And that doesn't really sound super intriguing. It just sounds like your random fantasy story, but I've heard very good things about this series. I've heard some people say that they thought it was as good, if not better, than Stormlight, which makes me go like, okay, I need to read this, I need to find out what my opinion is about this one. But as I said, plot-wise, I don't really know whether I'm that interested in it, but you know, plot-wise, maybe I wouldn't have been interested in Stormlight Archive neither, since nobody knows how to describe the plot of Stormlight Archive, so I'd definitely be interested in trying it out. And then the final one on this list might be one that you've never heard about, unless you follow my channel, and that is The Empty Throne by Daniel Polansky. So I read a arc for The Seventh Perfection, which is a sort of like novella by Daniel Polansky that came out in November, I think, or was it coming out in October? Don't remember anymore. I read it a few months ago at this point, and I absolutely loved that. I loved the sort of like, it was kind of experimental fantasy, which I love experimental writing in my general fiction, in my literary fiction, and apparently I also like it in fantasy. And so I really loved that one. It was kind of a fantasy mystery told only through one part of the dialogue. You were only given the answers, you weren't told the questions, and so it kind of meant that you had to kind of figure out what was taking place, figure out the story from there. And while I'm not somebody who likes detectives or likes mystery, that really worked for me very well, and I'm very much eager to dive into more of Daniel Polansky's work and figure out, you know, is the rest of his work like that? Is he always so experimental, or do I also like his more like normal stuff? And so The Empire, was it called like that? It was something with Empire, right? The Empty Throne was not called anything with Empire. The Empty Throne is a duology basically. It's got those above and those below, and these books kind of look at what happens when you have a population trying to overthrow their government, trying to rise up and you know, fight for their place in society, fight for equal rights. And their rebellion is basically squashed. Their rebellion fails. They are basically like, you know, a whole lot of them probably die in the effort. But what happens to a society like that? What happens when people have tried to stand up and it hasn't been successful? So we're kind of looking at 10 years in the future of this past rebellion period, and kind of looking at, you know, the way in which society has evolved and at efforts that are being made to rise up again. But so yeah, as I said at the beginning of this video, I don't know when I'll be able to get around to any of these books. I am hoping to get a lot more into fantasy in 2021, but I do also still want to tackle a lot of my unread books on these shelves, and a lot of them are not fantasy. However, I do have some set plans already for 2021, which you will hear about in my December videos. I will be making a reading goals video and a couple of fantasy themed videos as well in that month. But so yeah, I'm hoping that over the course of the coming years I'll be able to get quite a lot of these series off of my list, and then I'll make a new one, you know. That's the joy of it. There's so much fantasy that I haven't included in this video, and there will be so much more fantasy by the time I get around to making another one. But so yeah, hope you enjoyed this video. Definitely let me know down below if you've read any of these fantasy series, and like which one do I need to prioritize, which ones are you willing to kind of like vouch for, to say like, yeah, that's a great series, you should definitely be checking it out. And maybe if there's one that you're like, skip it, definitely let me know as well. But so yeah, we can chat about it further in the comments below. See you guys!